The desert has its own rhythm, a pulse that moves slower than the world beyond the dunes. Out here, time feels heavier, stretched between sunrise and sunset. I've grown used to that stillness. My days begin with the call of birds and end with the hush of wind slipping through the palms that line my courtyard. It has been years since I entertained a guest. I used to have company often when my son was still here, when laughter still found its way into these stone halls. Now the house is quiet. I've learned to live with it, or at least I've told myself I have. That evening, the sky was the color of dusted gold, fading to violet. I had just begun to change out of my travel clothes when I heard a knock, 3 sharp, hesitant raps against the old wooden door. I froze, half-buttoned shirt in hand, wondering who would come at this hour. Visitors were rare, unexpected ones even rarer. When I opened the door, a young man stood there, tall, sunburned, and dressed in clothes that looked worn from travel. His eyes caught the fading light, clear and uncertain. For a moment I thought he might have lost his way. "Good evening," he said, his voice low but steady. "I'm sorry to come unannounced. I was told I could find your son here." For a heartbeat I didn't know how to respond. My son's name still carried an echo in my chest. "You've just missed him," I said finally. "He's been away for some time now." The young man nodded as if he'd expected that answer. "I see. Then perhaps," he hesitated, shifting his weight. "Perhaps I came for the wrong reason. May I rest here for the night? The desert road is long and there's nowhere nearby to stay." There was something earnest in the way he said it, something that softened the reflexive caution in me. I stepped aside. "Of course. Come in. You look like you've been traveling for days." He smiled a little sheepishly. "It feels that way." Inside, the house felt suddenly alive again. The scent of sand and travel clung to him, mingling with the faint aroma of cardamom from the pot I had left simmering earlier. He looked around, taking in the arched ceilings, the faded rugs, the old photographs that lined the walls. "You have a beautiful home," he said. "It's quieter than it used to be," I replied, then added with a faint smile, "but it remembers." I led him to the small sitting room, where the evening breeze passed through the latticed window. "You said you were looking for my son," I began. "May I ask your name?" "Amir," he said. "We met briefly in the city some months ago. He mentioned you, spoke of this place, and I suppose I wanted to see it for myself." There was a flicker in his tone, something more than curiosity. But I didn't press him. I only nodded and offered him tea. As I poured, I felt his eyes linger, studying me not with the casual glance of a stranger but with the quiet attentiveness of someone trying to read a story written on a face. We talked about small things. His journey, the roads he'd taken, the changing seasons in the desert. His words carried a warmth that reached past politeness. I found myself listening more closely than I intended. When I stood to fetch a second pot of tea, I noticed his gaze follow me, not intrusive, just present. I told myself I was imagining it. After all, what interest could a man like him have in one who has long since crossed youth's horizon? Yet as the evening deepened, something unspoken began to settle between us. Not tension exactly, but awareness. He asked questions about my past, about the people who once filled this house, about the years I'd spent in solitude. I answered with care, though I could feel his curiosity reaching further, as if he sensed there was more beneath the surface. Later, as I showed him to the guest room, he paused at the doorway. "Thank you," he said softly. "You didn't have to open your home to a stranger." "Out here, strangers are a gift," I replied. "The desert teaches you that." He smiled again, a quiet, knowing smile that stayed with me long after I closed my own door. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind whispered against the windows, carrying the scent of sand and rain. I found myself thinking about the young man's eyes, how they seemed to carry both questions and answers. I told myself it was nothing. Just the echo of company after too long alone. But deep down I knew something had shifted. The desert had been still for many years. And now at last something, or someone, had stirred the wind again. The night had a weight to it, the kind that settles on your shoulders and refuses to lift. I stood by the window, watching the sand outside turn silver under the moonlight. In the distance, the dunes shifted like waves caught in stillness. Somewhere down the hall, I could hear Amir moving, the soft creak of the guestroom floorboards, the faint sound of running water. It had been years since another person's presence had filled this space. The air itself seemed changed by it, warmer somehow. I tried to tell myself it was simple hospitality. A traveler, a bed, a cup of tea. Nothing more. Yet my thoughts refused to quiet. I could still hear his voice, calm, deliberate, carrying that subtle rhythm of someone who has lived more in his years than his youth might suggest. After a time, I gave up on sleep and made my way to the kitchen. The lamp on the counter cast a small golden pool of light across the tiles. I poured myself a cup of water and stood there, listening to the house breathe. Then I heard it, footsteps soft and hesitant. Amir appeared in the doorway, dressed simply, hair damp from washing. He looked surprised to see me awake. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he said. "I couldn't sleep." I gestured toward the table. "Neither could I. Sit if you'd like." He hesitated, then crossed the room and sat opposite me. The quiet between us wasn't uncomfortable, more like a silence that had forgotten it was silence. "You live alone?" he asked after a moment. "For some years now," I said. "The house used to be full, family, friends, visitors. Now it's just me and the wind." He smiled faintly. "Doesn't it get lonely?" I considered the question. "Sometimes. But you learn to make peace with your own company. The desert doesn't leave room for many distractions. It teaches you to listen." "To what?" "To what's still inside you." He looked down, tracing a finger along the rim of his glass. "I think that's why I came here," he said softly. "I thought maybe, if I saw the place your son spoke about, I'd understand something. About myself. About him." I nodded, though I sensed there was more he wasn't saying. The candle flickered between us, and for a moment his face was illuminated. The fine lines of concentration, the quiet vulnerability. "Your son," he continued, "spoke of you as if you were someone rare. Someone who had learned to live without needing the world to notice." That made me laugh quietly. I think he was exaggerating. Maybe. But he admired you. Amir's tone softened. "And I think I do too." The words caught me off guard. I looked at him, and for the first time I realized how closely he'd been studying me, not with judgment or even curiosity, but with something like recognition. There was a warmth that grew in the space between us, unspoken and uncertain. I felt it, and from the way he looked at me I knew he did too. "You should rest," I said gently. "The desert is easier to face after sleep." He didn't move right away. "Will you be here in the morning?" I smiled. "I'm not going anywhere." Something in him relaxed, as if the answer had been more important than the question. He nodded, thanked me again, and disappeared down the hall. I stayed in the kitchen long after he'd gone, listening to the faint sounds of the house settling. I told myself the warmth in my chest was simple kindness, the comfort of having another soul nearby. But as I finally returned to my room, I caught my reflection in the mirror, a man older, quieter, yet somehow alive in a way he hadn't been in years. When I lay down, the moonlight traced the outline of the window on the floor. My mind drifted back to his eyes, the calm of his voice, the way he'd said he admired me. Admiration. A harmless word. And yet it lingered. Sleep came only in fragments. I dreamed of voices carried on the wind, laughter, half-remembered touches, the feeling of being seen. When I woke before dawn, I felt both weary and strangely light, as if something within me had been turned slightly toward the sun. Through the narrow window, I saw the first line of light breaking across the horizon. Somewhere in the house, I heard movement again, the sound of footsteps, gentle and familiar. The restless night was ending, but something else had begun. A quiet stirring. A question without words. And beneath it all, the faint, steady beat of something I hadn't felt in a very long time: hope. The desert at dawn has its own language. The light arrives slowly, brushing the dunes in silver before they turn to gold. The air feels almost holy then, cool, still, and full of promise. When I stepped into the courtyard that morning, the world seemed washed clean after the long, restless night. I half expected Amir to still be asleep, but he was already there, sitting on the low wall near the fountain. The wind toyed with his hair, and his eyes were fixed on the horizon as though he were waiting for the sun to speak. "You wake early," I said, my voice soft in the morning hush. He turned and smiled. "I couldn't stay in bed. The light here feels different. It doesn't just rise, it unfolds." I poured 2 cups of tea and handed him one. Steam curled into the air between us. "The desert teaches you to notice small things," I said. "There isn't much else to distract you." He nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip. "Maybe that's what I've been needing, to notice things again." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint trickle of water in the fountain, the cry of distant birds. It was the kind of silence that didn't demand to be filled. After some time he spoke again. "Your son told me stories about this place, about how you used to bring people here for music, for poetry, for conversation. It sounded alive." "It was," I said, smiling faintly. "There was laughter in these halls once. Friends, students, travelers. People came and went like tides. Then one day the tide stopped coming. Why? I shrugged lightly. Life changes. People move on. And I grew tired of being the one who stayed. He looked at me, then really looked, as if searching for the years I had tried to hide beneath calm words. Do you ever wish you'd left too? Sometimes, I admitted. But then I think of mornings like this, of how quiet the world can be when it isn't demanding anything of you. And I realize, perhaps this solitude isn't punishment. Perhaps it's a kind of peace. He considered that, turning his cup in his hands. Peace, he said softly. That's something I've never found. I've been running for so long I'm not even sure what I'm running from anymore. I watched him for a moment. His face was open, honest in a way that disarmed me. You're young, I said. Peace comes when you stop asking the world to give it to you. He smiled, but there was something wistful in it. That sounds like something a man who's already found peace would say. Or someone still searching, I replied. The wind rose slightly, carrying with it the scent of sand and jasmine from the garden. He set his cup down and looked toward the dunes. I came here because your son once told me you understood what it meant to lose and still keep living. I thought maybe if I met you I could understand how. His words caught me unprepared. I had expected curiosity, politeness, not confession. And what have you lost, Amir? He hesitated, eyes on the horizon. Someone I cared about, he said finally. Someone I couldn't save from himself. After that, everything I touched started to feel temporary. Like I was standing on shifting sand. I felt the ache in his words, familiar, deep. Loss recognizes itself in another's voice. I'm sorry, I said quietly. The hardest part of loss isn't the absence, it's what it leaves behind, the silence that refuses to fade. He looked at me then, his expression soft but searching. You speak as if you've known that silence. I have, I admitted. I once loved someone who saw the world differently than I did. When he was gone, the world lost its color for a while. But one day the light returned, not as bright as before but gentler. Enough to see by. For a long time neither of us spoke. The sun had risen fully now, painting the sand in shades of amber and rose. Amir's eyes caught the light, and in them I saw a reflection of something fragile but alive, hope, perhaps, or the first trace of trust. When he finally stood, he said softly, You make it sound as if pain can become something beautiful. Maybe it can, I replied. If we let it. He smiled, not the polite smile of a guest but something real, something quiet and warm. I think I'd like to learn how. I watched as he walked a few steps toward the dunes, the hem of his shirt fluttering in the breeze. The desert light wrapped around him like a promise. And for the first time in many years, I felt something within me stir. A small, cautious flicker, but enough to remind me that I was still capable of feeling more than memory. The desert morning had unfolded fully now. And with it, perhaps, the beginning of something neither of us had expected. Not love, not yet, but the slow, steady heartbeat of possibility. Days passed with the quiet rhythm of the desert. The young man did not leave after that first morning. He said he wanted to stay just a few more days, but those days turned into weeks. I found I didn't mind. The house, which had felt like an echo of my former life, now carried the faint pulse of laughter again, light, hesitant, but alive. Amir had a way of bringing movement into stillness. He filled the silence without breaking it. In the mornings he would wander the dunes with his sketchbook, drawing the shapes of the sand and the flight of birds. In the evenings he would sit across from me, asking questions I hadn't been asked in years. What was it like when you were young? He asked one night as the sun disappeared behind the dunes. I laughed softly. Longer days, shorter nights. Fewer regrets, maybe? He smiled. And love? The question lingered in the air. I looked into the cup of tea between my hands, watching the steam curl and fade. Love, I repeated quietly. Love was a quiet rebellion. Something we carried carefully because not everyone saw it as something meant to be shared. Amir watched me closely, his expression tender. Was it worth it? I met his gaze. Every moment of it. He didn't press for more and I didn't offer it. But something unspoken passed between us, an understanding born not from words, but from the simple act of being seen. Later that evening he brought out one of his sketches, a drawing of the courtyard under moonlight. It feels alive here, he said. Like the house breathes differently now. Perhaps it does, I said. Or perhaps it's the people inside it. He looked down, embarrassed by the compliment he hadn't meant to make, but the warmth of it stayed with me long after he retired to his room. The following afternoon, a rare sandstorm began to build on the horizon. The sky turned copper and the wind howled across the open space. I moved through the house, closing shutters, securing the doors. Amir helped, his movements quick and deliberate. The storm hit just as we finished, the sound of it roaring against the walls like an ocean made of dust. When the power flickered and died, the house was left in half-light. We lit candles and sat together in the main room, the air thick with heat and the faint scent of wax. "Does this happen often?" Amir asked. "Not often enough to fear," I said. "But often enough to remember that the desert is always stronger than we are." He smiled faintly. "You don't sound afraid. I've lived long enough to know storms pass." He was quiet for a while. Then, in the dim glow, he said softly, "You speak like someone who's had to wait through many storms." I looked at him, then really looked. The candlelight carved his features in gold and shadow. "I have," I said. "Some left scars, others left peace." He leaned forward slightly, curiosity flickering in his eyes. "And which do I bring?" The question struck something deep inside me. I could have laughed it away or dismissed it as youthful boldness, but instead I said quietly, "I don't know yet. But I feel something shift when you're near, as if the silence I made peace with has started asking questions again." He didn't answer at first. Then very softly he said, "Then maybe I'm here for a reason." The wind outside howled, shaking the windows. Between the gusts, the silence inside the house grew heavy and tender. There were no more words, only the steady flicker of light reflecting in his eyes. When morning came, the storm had passed. The world outside was changed, the sand smoothed over, the air crisp and clear. The courtyard, washed clean, shimmered with light. We stepped out together, both quiet as if the world had been reborn overnight. "Look," Amir said, pointing toward the horizon. A small desert flower had bloomed near the edge of the wall, its petals pale against the sand. "It's strange how life insists on returning." "Life always finds a way," I said. "Even where it seems impossible." He looked at me then, and for a heartbeat, I saw that same persistence, the quiet strength of someone who had wandered through his own storms and still chosen to reach for light. In that moment, I felt an ache I hadn't known in years, not of pain but of recognition. I wanted to say something, to tell him that his presence had reminded me what it felt like to look forward instead of back. But the words wouldn't come. Instead I said simply, "Tea?" He smiled, and it was enough. That evening, as he sketched by lamplight, he said, "When I leave, I'll miss this place." "Then don't leave yet," I replied. He glanced up, surprised, and then nodded, a small smile curving his lips. "I won't." And so he stayed. The nights grew cooler, the stars sharper, and the air between us gentler. We spoke less but understood more. The silence, once a shield, had become a bridge, something that connected rather than protected. Old wounds don't always heal. Sometimes they simply learn to live with the light. And in Amir's presence, I began to understand that perhaps mine were ready to do the same. It was the second storm that changed everything. The first had passed through like a visitor, fierce but brief. This one came without warning, born from heat and distance. The air grew thick that afternoon, the sky gathering weight. By dusk, the horizon had vanished in a blur of gold and ash. I was standing near the courtyard steps when Amir appeared beside me, watching the sky shift. "It's coming fast," he said, brushing hair from his forehead. "The desert doesn't believe in patience," I replied. "When it moves all at once." We hurried to bring in the cushions and latch the shutters. The wind arrived before we were ready, rushing through the open arches, scattering dust and petals across the floor. When we finally closed the last door, the storm struck with full force. The lights flickered once, then went dark. Amir turned to me, his face caught for a second in the dim flash of lightning. "Now what?" I reached for the matches, lighting a single candle. "Now," I said, "we wait." We sat in the main hall, the candle between us. The walls shook under the wind's anger, but the small flame held steady, trembling but unbroken. Its light fell over Amir's face, his eyes wide and calm, reflecting gold. "It's strange," he said after a long silence. "The storm sounds frightening, but I don't feel afraid. Not here." "Storms pass," I said again, smiling faintly. "That's something you learn with age." He looked at me with quiet amusement. "You talk about age as if it's a distance between us. Isn't it? Maybe in years," he said. "But not in the things that matter." I met his gaze, uncertain what he meant, or maybe I did know and was only pretending not to. The wind roared against the house, but inside, it felt impossibly still. Amir leaned back, his voice low. "You told me once that the desert teaches you to listen. What do you hear now?" I paused, listening. The storm. The wind. You. And beneath that? I hesitated. something quieter. Like a voice I'd forgotten. He nodded, almost as if he understood. Maybe that voice is what called me here. For a long moment, the only sound was the beating of the storm. Then, very softly, Amir said, "I need to tell you something." I waited. "When I first came here," he began, "I told you I was looking for your son. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. He spoke of you, yes, but not as a man speaks of his father. He spoke of your kindness, your strength, your way of seeing the world. And I wanted to see it for myself. I wanted to meet the man behind those words." His voice trembled slightly, not with fear but with honesty. "I didn't expect to stay. I didn't expect to feel this peace. Or this confusion." My breath caught, though I said nothing. The storm filled the silence for us. "I thought it was just admiration," he continued. "But it's more than that now. I can't explain it. I only know that being near you makes the world quieter. That when you speak, something in me stops running." The words hung between us, fragile as the candlelight. I closed my eyes for a moment. I could have said many things, the careful, sensible words an older man learns to keep ready for moments like this. But none of them would have been true. "Amir," I said finally, my voice low, "you remind me of something I thought I'd forgotten, that it's possible to be seen without shame. But I don't want to be the reason you stop searching. You have so much ahead of you." He shook his head slowly. "Maybe that's why I found you. Because I needed to stop searching for a while." The candle flickered then, a soft shiver of light. His hand was resting near mine on the table, close enough that I could feel its warmth even without touch. Outside, the storm began to ease. The wind softened to a whisper, the sand no longer striking the walls. When the silence returned, it was almost startling. Amir looked at me, his voice a whisper. "You don't have to say anything. I just needed you to know." I looked at him, at the sincerity in his eyes, the vulnerability that asked for no reward. Something inside me, long dormant, stirred again, not a flame but an ember finding breath. "I know," I said quietly. "And I'm grateful." We sat there until the candle burned low, the room dimming into shadow. There were no declarations, no promises, only the faint hum of connection as constant as the wind. When I finally rose to check the windows, I found the storm had passed completely. The night outside was washed clean, the stars bright once more. Amir followed me to the doorway, standing beside me in silence. "The air smells different," he said. "It always does after rain," I replied. "Everything feels possible again." He smiled then, that same gentle, unguarded smile, and I realized how right he was. That night, after he went to his room, I stood alone beneath the open sky. The desert stretched endlessly, glimmering under the moonlight. I thought of his words, "When you speak, something in me stops running." And for the first time in years I felt the same. The storm had come and gone, but it had left behind something the wind could not erase. A confession, a quiet truth, and the tender beginning of a bond neither of us had planned for. The desert was unrecognizable the next morning. Rain had brushed over it during the night, not enough to drown the dunes, but enough to soften them, to leave a delicate sheen that caught the first light of dawn. The air smelled clean, cool, almost sweet. I stepped outside before sunrise. Puddles, rare as miracles, glimmered in the courtyard. The palm leaves bowed with tiny drops that glittered like glass. For a moment I simply stood there, listening. The kind of quiet that follows a storm is its own kind of music. Amir joined me soon after, barefoot, still sleepy-eyed, his hair slightly damp. "It's beautiful," he whispered, as if the desert might vanish if spoken to too loudly. "It doesn't rain often," I said. "When it does, the earth remembers every drop." We walked together along the wall, neither of us saying much. Every so often, his shoulder brushed mine. An accident perhaps, but one neither of us hurried to correct. Later we shared breakfast in the courtyard. The light had turned gold by then, washing everything in warmth. Amir was sketching again, his pencil gliding quickly, as if afraid the moment might fade before he could capture it. "You draw as though the world might disappear," I said. He smiled without looking up. "Maybe it will. I like having proof that it was ever here." I watched him work for a while. His concentration had a kind of grace, not perfection but sincerity. It reminded me of the way people love when they haven't yet learned to guard their hearts. "Will you keep the drawings?" I asked. "I think so," he said. "Though some things are meant to stay where they're made." He looked at me then, and there was no need to ask what he meant. Some moments are their own destination, not to be carried away, only to be lived fully once. The days that followed carried a calm unlike any I had known in years. We fell into a rhythm. Mornings in the courtyard, afternoons walking among the dunes, evenings filled with quiet conversation. He asked questions I had forgotten to ask myself, about what it meant to grow older, to forgive, to still want. I answered with the honesty age allows, no longer trying to sound wise. Sometimes when the sun set, we would sit in the fading light without speaking at all. Words felt unnecessary, presence was enough. One evening, Amir brought out his sketchbook and placed it in my hands. "I want you to see something," he said. I turned the pages slowly. There were dunes, palms, the arches of the house, and between them, sketches of me. Not grand portraits, just glimpses. The curve of my hands holding a cup, my reflection in a window, the shadow of my profile beneath lamplight. I looked up, startled. "You've been drawing me?" He nodded. "You said once that the desert teaches you to notice small things." I noticed. I felt a warmth rise in my chest that I could neither name nor hide. "You've made me look kinder than I am." "No," he said softly. "Just as you are when you forget the world is watching." The honesty in his voice left me quiet for a long time. The wind moved gently through the open doors, carrying the scent of rain-washed sand. That night, after he had gone to his room, I lingered by the fountain. The moon floated high above, bright enough to paint silver lines across the stone. I realized that I could no longer imagine the house without his presence. His laughter echoing through the halls, his quiet questions, the way his gaze met mine without fear. It frightened me, that realization. Not because of what it meant, but because of how natural it felt. I had spent years convincing myself that certain doors had closed for good, that love, companionship, even gentle affection belonged to another lifetime. Yet here he was, walking easily through those forgotten doors, uninvited and entirely welcome. The following morning, Amir found me in the study, sorting through old letters. He leaned against the doorway, watching me for a while before speaking. "You look lighter these days," he said. I smiled. "Maybe the rain washed some of the dust off me." He stepped closer, his voice soft. "Or maybe you just remembered how to let the light in." For a heartbeat, the room seemed to still, the dust motes floating in shafts of sunlight, his eyes holding mine. No words were needed after that. We both understood what had changed. Nothing dramatic, nothing sudden. Just a quiet acceptance, an unspoken promise that we were no longer strangers to each other's solitude. Evening came and we sat outside watching the horizon fade. The dunes shimmered like liquid bronze. Amir leaned back on his hands, breathing deeply. "It feels like the world is holding its breath," he murmured. "Maybe it is," I said. "Maybe it's waiting for us to exhale first." He laughed softly, that gentle, honest laugh that had become the heartbeat of the house. And as the stars began to appear, I realized that peace didn't mean emptiness. It meant sharing silence with someone who understood it. The morning after the rain had become something more than a day. It was a threshold, the quiet turning of the story from loneliness toward belonging. The end came softly, as all endings should. There was no great farewell, no declaration to mark the moment, only the gradual understanding that the days were thinning, like the last golden threads of sunlight before dusk. Amir had been restless for a few mornings. I could feel it before he said a word. His sketches had grown fewer, his eyes drawn often to the horizon. The desert does that to people. It gives them clarity, then sends them on their way. One evening, as we watched the last light fade behind the dunes, he said quietly, "I think it's time I left soon." The words didn't surprise me, though they landed softly, like a leaf falling onto water. "Where will you go?" I asked. "I don't know yet," he said. "Maybe north, maybe back to the city. I thought I came here to find something, maybe your son, maybe myself, but now I think I was meant to lose something instead." "Lose?" I asked. He nodded. "The fear of stopping. The need to run from silence." I smiled faintly. "The desert has a way of taking what no longer serves us." He turned toward me, eyes reflecting the last glow of the sun. "And it gives something back too." "What did it give you?" He hesitated, then said simply, "You." There was no need to reply. The words hung between us, unadorned and perfect in their honesty. I reached for my tea, pretending not to notice the tremor in my hands. He didn't look away. That night we didn't talk much. We shared the quiet the way old friends share a meal, with comfort, with gratitude, with the knowledge that nothing more was needed. The air was still and clear, the stars sharp as glass. When I finally went to bed, I didn't sleep. I listened instead, to the faint sound of him moving in the next room, to the wind that slipped through the open window, carrying with it the scent of night jasmine and sand. I wondered how the house would sound when he was gone, whether the silence would return to what it was before, or if it had changed shape forever. Morning arrived, pale and gentle. Amir was already awake, his bag packed. The courtyard was filled with golden light, the kind that makes everything appear softer, more forgiving. We stood together near the gate, and for the first time, I noticed how young he truly was, not just in years but in spirit, in the way the world still stretched endlessly before him. "I'll come back," he said, his smile uncertain but hopeful. "I'll hold you to that," I replied. He looked at me for a long moment as if memorizing something invisible, the lines of the courtyard, the stillness of the palms, perhaps even the way I stood. Then, almost shyly, he said, "You've changed me more than I can explain." I wanted to tell him the same, that he had brought light into a life that had been living quietly in shadow, that his presence had reminded me what it felt like to be seen, to be known without explanation. But the words stayed inside me, folded between breaths. Some truths are too sacred to be spoken aloud. Instead I said, "Then let that change be your companion on the road." He nodded, and in the golden silence that followed he reached out, not to shake my hand, not to embrace me, but to rest his fingers lightly on mine for the briefest moment. The touch was simple, human, enough to say what neither of us could. Then he turned and began walking into the open desert. I watched until the horizon swallowed him, his figure becoming smaller, his steps sure and steady, until all that remained was a faint trail of footprints that the wind would soon erase. For a long time I stood there. Then, slowly I returned to the courtyard. The teapot was still warm, 2 cups still waiting. I poured one for myself and one for the space across from me. Old habits die kindly. The day passed as all days do. But everything looked a little different, the light more golden, the air more generous. I realized that the silence had changed. It no longer felt empty. It felt full, of echoes, of laughter, of something gentle left behind. Weeks passed. Sometimes I would find his sketches tucked between books, left as if by accident, a corner of the courtyard, the fountain under moonlight, even a drawing of my hands holding a cup. They were small fragments of presence, reminders that what had bloomed between us was real, however brief. In the evenings when the wind rose, I would step outside and listen. The desert always speaks to those who wait long enough. And sometimes, if the air was still, I could almost hear his voice, faint, carried on the wind, calling out from some distant horizon. The desert has many ways of keeping company. One night, as I sat beneath the stars, I opened my old journal for the first time in years. On a blank page I wrote, "He came as a guest and left as a memory, and yet, somehow the house feels more alive than before. Love is not the claim of possession but the quiet permission to continue. If he never returns, the wind will carry our names. And that will be enough." I closed the book and looked out toward the dunes. The night stretched endlessly, silver and alive. Somewhere far away, Amir was walking new roads, finding new lights. But the space he had filled within me remained, not as ache, not as longing, but as warmth. The desert had taught me that love need not be loud to be lasting. Sometimes, it is a moment that reshapes a lifetime, a single crossing of paths that changes the color of one's solitude forever. And so, when the wind passed through the palms and whispered against the stone, I smiled. I imagined it carried both our names, woven together, 2 travelers who had met beneath the same sky, and left each other better than before.